Hey, Echo family, so good to see everybody. Thanks for joining us at all of our locations today. Before we jump in our topic, I just want to remind you this week is First Wednesday, and it is the time of the month that we get together. This time it's at the Fremont campus, and we worship, we pray, we seek to encounter God together, and this one's very special. We're going to give a special gift to everybody that comes and give you a glimpse into some important things coming up in the next couple months. So don't miss First Wednesday. It is such a great experience, one of the best times of the month for us to gather as well. Now, today, we're kicking off Blessable. I know, not a word, but we're talking about the kind of life that God longs to bless. There is that kind of life. Now, I don't know about you, but it feels to me like culturally, the word blessing has gotten way diluted over the last several years. To you, it might be like what you say maybe when you eat a good meal, right? Like you sit around the table and that's like the blessing. God, thank you for this food. Or to some people, it's what you say after you sneeze. And you're like, bless you. Bless you. And it's just kind of that word you just throw out when random things like that happen. Or maybe it's when you buy something really special, like the big house, the big car, and you're like, that is blessing. That person is blessed. And then, one of the trends of the last 5 years is just you do something really cool and you take the selfie and you hashtag blessed. And that's basically what we call these days being blessed. But what if it's way more than that? What if the blessing of God is actually possible to attain and to have, and it's more than just like a splash of goodness in your life, but it is decisions and choices that we can make that literally call on the very favor and grace of God upon our lives. See, when Jesus talked about blessing, he did it very differently than how we see it superficially. He would say things like this: God blesses those who are poor and recognize their need for me. He would say things like, God blesses you when you mourn. Or he'd say, God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you because you are my followers. See, he seems to indicate that there is a kind of favor that we can have even during unfavorable times. That even when things are not going so well and you don't have all the resources and you don't feel like everything's going well, work or at school, whatever else, that there can be a kind of favor, a grace, a presence that we can attain and have in our lives that goes beyond the superficial happiness and circumstances of life. And I'm guessing that if there is such a thing, that you, like me, you want it. You want to know what it's like to have that kind of favor. Well, I want to show you today that there is one. In fact, over the last few years, my understanding of blessing has greatly changed. To me, it used to be that kind of thing, like sneeze, bless you, and, oh, that person's kind of blessed. It's like reactive and looking backwards. But now, over the last few years, I've gotten to understand a little bit more that there is actually an authority that followers of Jesus have to project and to speak grace over things and people. And there's a decision and there are priorities that we can have in our life that literally God will say, hey, because of those choices, I will extend, the Bible calls it extending the right hand of favor over you, and I'm going to bless you. And when you have that blessing, it's like you have wind in your sails, or you find yourself like swimming with the waves, or maybe to make it more applicable to our area, it's like having AI work on your behalf, right? And you're like, you can't cheat with AI, but it sure can accelerate your preparation for school and for work and whatever else. Or if you ride bikes, it's like the electric bike, where you have some of your effort, but it's going way beyond what you're putting in. That's what happens when the blessing of God is on our life. There is something that is behind us and in front of us and over us that is beyond just the natural. We're defining it like this. If you're taking notes, you might want to write it down, that the blessing of God is the favor and the life-producing fruit or ability that God extends to those that align their lives with His will. It's when you find yourself with a wind from God behind you because you've aligned your decisions, your priorities, your life with His desires, and it's so much bigger than circumstance. And to learn more about this, we're going to take a dive into an Old Testament book called Haggai. Now, Haggai, I know it's a weird word. I don't even know the right way to pronounce it, but I heard it's something like Haggai, but it makes you spit on people. If you don't know where it is, it's in the Old Testament. So if you have a Bible, you want to open it there. If you don't, it's okay. It'll be on the screen. But you go to Matthew, which is like the first book of the New Testament, and then you go backwards 3 books. And it's just a few pages there, and it's right there, Haggai. Now, to give you some context, Haggai came during a time that the people of God, the Jewish people, had experienced what's called the Babylonian captivity. It's in 605 BC to 538 BC, so like 500 years before Christ came to earth. This was happening. If you studied it in history, you might remember this time. The Babylonian captivity was a time when the Jewish people were forcibly relocated to what's now Iraq. It used to be called Babylon. And they literally had to leave because their towns, their cities, and their temple got destroyed. So they were held captive by the Babylonians for 70 years. But then in 538 BC, the Jews had a permission from Cyrus the Great. God moved in his heart, and Cyrus the Great said, you know what? You can go back. And God told the people, go back to your land and rebuild the temple and rebuild your cities. So 50,000 Jews began the journey back into Israel to rebuild the temple, which was like the center of life. I'll tell you more about this in a second. And to basically rebuild their life and their cities. And then from 536 BC, they finished the temple foundation. So they built the whole foundation of the temple, and then they forgot their mission. So for 16 years after that, from 536 to 520 BC, they just started to build their own homes. They kind of built the foundation of the temple, and like, God, I know you told us to do this whole thing, but we got so much that we need to do for us now, so let us just build our own stuff and prioritize our own stuff, and maybe later we'll go back to your temple. So 16 years went by until God sends Haggai, 520 BC. And when he sends Haggai, I love Haggai because he's a prophet that didn't come like other prophets with like a heavy message, but he came with inspiration, with questions, and calling people to just consider their ways and to make the choices that lead to life. So we pick it up there. If you have your Bible, open it up. It's chapter 1, okay? And it goes like this. On August 29th of the second year of King Darius' reign, the Lord gave a message through the prophet Haggai. Verse 2, this is what the Lord of heaven's army says. The people are saying, the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Now, reminding you, it's been 16 years they've been saying, not yet, God. Not yet. I know you told us to do this thing, but like, not yet, not yet, not yet. 16 years go by, and God says, the people are still saying, not yet to me. And then the Lord sent this message to the prophet Haggai. Why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? This is what the Lord of Heaven's army says. Look at what's happening to you. Now, that little phrase, look at what's happening to you, is really significant. In fact, when we study the Bible, we always try to teach you how to study the Bible as well. You have to notice repetition. Repetition is there for a reason, and in the book of Haggai, that little phrase is repeated 4 different times. It is the poetic structure of the book to bring your attention to it. And that little phrase, look at what's happening to you, is in the New Living Translation, but other translations say it a little different. Let me show you what it means. So the Amplified Bible would say this: consider your ways and thoughtfully reflect on your conduct. The Message translation says, take a good, hard look at your life and think it over. So the prophet keeps saying, stop and think. Stop and think. The NIV says, give careful thought to your ways. I think a more modern translation, I call it the Filipe translation, it would be, how's it working for you? How's it really working for you? So the prophet is like laying out the facts. And he's like, you're building your homes and you neglected what God told you to do. How's it working for you? because it sure seems like some things are not like you wished. In fact, he goes on and he says this in verse 6, you have planted much, but harvest little. You eat, you're not satisfied. You drink, but you're still thirsty. You put on clothes, but you cannot keep warm. And I think this one's relatable. He says, your wages, they disappear as though you were putting them in pockets filled with holes. In other words, how's it working for you? This whole idea of like, let me build my own stuff and neglect putting God first in my life, is it working out? Because it sure seems like your life is empty. It sure seems like there's a whole lot of effort and not a lot of fruit. It sure seems like you're in this pattern of like working, producing, and creating, and all this stuff that you're doing for yourself. But when you lay your head on your bed at night, there's anxiety, and there's emptiness, and there's a sense in you that there's just something that is missing. I wonder if you felt this way. Like you work and you create and you make money, but it's just never enough. Like there's a part of you that you just know, man, there's got to be more to this. So God begins to show them what they're doing that's robbing them of the blessing he longs to give them. See, God doesn't want to withhold his blessing, but our decisions make him do so at times. So he's revealing it to them through Haggai. And one of the things, if you're taking notes, you want to write down is this. What robs us of God's blessing, first of all, is delayed obedience. See, I tell my kids this, delayed obedience is disobedience. And that's another way of saying it. And what the people kept saying to God is, not yet. Like first, God, I know you gave me some priorities. I know your word says some things about whatever decisions I make, but I just not yet. Sometimes we say not yet to people, right? Like some of you, a lot of our churches, you're singles, and you know you have family sometimes that pressure you. You're like, when are you going to start dating? When are you going to get married? And you just, maybe you don't say not yet. Maybe you say shut up. I don't know what your posture is, but it gets to the point, it's like, not yet. Or when you get married, you know, grandparents, like, when are you going to give me some kids? You're like, it's not your kids. They'll be my kids. Stop claiming them for yourself too early, right? But you're like, not yet. But sometimes there's serious things. Like God spoke to you and told you to stop whatever hurtful habits you have, and addictions and you know, of sexual stuff and substances and whatever other choices are hurting you. And you're like, not yet, God. Like, let me first enjoy myself, and let me first build my stuff before I show you this kind of love and affection and priority in my life. Let me first do everything I wish I can do, and then maybe later after college or after high school or after I get married or after I buy the house or after I'll put you first. Delayed obedience is disobedience, and it robs us from God's blessing. But the second thing we see in Haggai is that partial obedience robs us of God's blessing. I want to remind you of what God told him to do. The 50,000 people that moved back into that place, they were called to rebuild the temple, but they built a foundation. The foundation was partial obedience. And then they're like, God, can you bless us for this partial obedience? And God's like, well, I want to, but how about you fully obey? Because that's really when my blessing will come over your life. And we do this a lot. We're like, God, I prayed before I started dating that boy, and God, I'm serving in my church now, and God, I'm giving some of my money away, but we're like, God, where's your blessing with that? But we've neglected other things that he already told us to do, like to work on the habit that's been destructive to us, and to work on that sin and that wrongdoing that has been destructive to others, and to consider the posture of giving, not just the act of giving, and whatever else God told us to do. See, sometimes in my home, we have a dish day for every day where our kids are assigned to do dishes, and my day is the weekend. And sometimes what I do in my day, I've told you this before if you've been here, but I will pay a child to do my day. I know it's cheating, but I'm the dad. I can cheat, and I pay. That's a good deal, But my kids do a great job, but every now and then, I'll be like, all right, who wants to do all the dishes? And I'll give you $20 on my day because I don't want to do the dishes on my day. And every now and then, one of them will do some. And they'll come back and like, where's my money, Dad? And I look over it, I was like, you did 3 plates. And you're asking me for the money. How about you do the whole thing and wipe that counter really clean, and then you come ask for the blessing? I think we do this with God all the time. God's told us to do the dishes or to obey and whatever else, and to do it out of gratitude and out of love for Him and in relationship with Him. And we're like, well, God, I did a little bit. How about you give me my stuff now so I can go do my own thing? But let me remind you that God's blessing, it comes when we align our lives with His will, not our will. Partial obedience is disobedience, and delayed obedience is disobedience. But number 3 is perhaps the most important one. What robs us of God's blessing is misplaced priorities. See, when God gets crowded out of our lives, we find ourselves in a place where His blessing and His grace and His presence is no longer there. Sometimes it's even accidental. See, God, He said this to the people. Why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? Now, my house, in this context, represented the temple. And I know we don't do temples anymore like they used to, but the temple symbolized God's desire to be with people. It was really never about the temple or the building structure. God doesn't need temples built by human hands to live among us. It was a symbol to humanity. It was a symbol that communicated His love toward us, His desire to know us, His desire to be with us. And their call to build the temple is the call that we have today to prioritize God's work on the earth. So when God told them, go and build my temple, it was not about the temple. It was about their lives having the purpose of taking God to the people and people to their God. It was the calling that we share today, those of us that call ourselves Christians. So when Jesus says, I will build my church, that's what He's building today. And He invites those that follow Him to be about that. It is the same calling as rebuilding the temple. We're taking people to God and God to the people. It is their call and the call to prioritize God first. In fact, there's one thing out of this message I hope you get. And I woke up with this a few days ago so clearly. I had dreams about this little phrase, and I woke up and I felt God say, I want you to tell the people this, like to summarize it here. God must be first. In fact, can we say this together, all of our campuses? You might not even believe it yet, but just entertain me here. 1, 2, 3. God must be first. Not second, not third, not fourth, not fifth. When God is first, He extends His blessing over us. That's when life really flourishes. The people started with passion, with purpose. God, you're first. But they got discouraged. They started to, in fact, Ezra, the book of Ezra in the Old Testament tells us the context of what's happening here, but they were being sued. Their property went up in cost. The neighbors started to yell at them. They were discouraged by politicians to build a temple. So they like all the pressure. They're just like, okay, God, I'll just focus on myself, and then I'll go back to God later. God, my PG&E bill keeps doubling every single year. Can I just do this another time? Like, what else we say to God? There's pressures, and we get it. What they were saying is, not yet, God. Before giving you my time, my resources, and my energy, let me first build my career. Let me first have as much pleasure as I want. Let me first build up my savings and my 403Bs or 501k, or did I say that right? Whatever the thing is that we do these days. And my retirement funds and my college funds, and let me first buy my nice car, and let me first find my life partner. Let me first graduate college, and then I'll consider living a pure life and prioritizing you. Then I'll make your priorities my priorities. And God says, how's it working for you? Give careful thoughts to your ways and consider the fruit of your life. And here's the thing. Without God's blessing, our efforts produce very little fruit. You might have superficial fruit, like you get money in the bank and whatever else, but that internal fruit, that sense of fulfillment and pleasure of God, that part of us that just knows like, man, my life is flourishing, my life counts, there's something significant God's doing in me, it starts to lack when God is last. So he calls them to reconsider their ways. And I love what he says here next. He says, this is what the Lord of Heaven's armies says. Repeat the phrase again. He says, look at what's happening to you. Like, how's it working for you? And then he commissions them again. Go up to the hill. In fact, he starts with the word now, which I think is significant. Because remember, they kept saying not yet. And he's like, now, go up to the hill, come down the hill and bring the timber and rebuild my house. But let me tell you what's really happening here. See, if you read the whole story, you realize that before all of this, when God brought him over to the land, he moved in the heart of the king to provide the timber from the forest of Lebanon, which is like the best wood out there, to go rebuild the temple. But there's a little phrase earlier that we use that helps us see what's really happening here. He says, why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? And the modern translations put luxurious houses, but it's really not luxurious houses, that it's the point of the whole thing. The literal translation, it says, why have you built paneled houses while my house lies in ruins? And the little word panel, it communicates, and most scholars agree, that they got very expensive wood from the forest of Lebanon to build their homes. Literally, what God told them to do is go up the mountain and get the forest, the Lebanon, the wood of this precious wood, and then come down the mountain and build my temple. And what they did is they went up and they got the wood and they came down and they built their houses with the resources of God. And then they said, God, where's my blessing? How's it working for you, he says. How's it working for you to not acknowledge me as the ultimate provider of your life? They used God's provision primarily for their pleasure, not God's purposes. Say, God, I know that you're the creator and every breath I have is yours or whatever else, but I'm going to take the stuff that you've given to me in my life and I'm going to think of only me with it. They robbed God. And life got hard. Their bills doubled. They were being oppressed. They were in a land that was expensive to live in. They had excuses, but God kept saying, why do you keep saying not yet? Because I long to bless you. But yet you've taken everything I've given you and you focused only on yourself. Can I speak to those of us in the Echo family as your pastor for just a minute here? I know we have guests every week here at Echo. We love you. So glad you came. Just give me like a few minutes to speak to our family for this purpose. See, I think this is a major blind spot in the church. Like in the church in our country. In fact, statistically speaking, it's even worse here in the Bay Area. Because we are known in the Bay Area as the metropolitan area with the most amount of resources and wealth of any other metropolitan area in the country. And statistically speaking, we are the greediest. We give the least amount of money away and make the most amount of money, and we're consumed with ourselves. And we tell ourselves it's because it's expensive and blah, 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 and it is. But God's saying to the people of God, you're acting just like the world when you do that. Wow, my temple, my purposes, and all these people around you have no relationship with me, and I literally sent my son to die for all of them. You're all so busy building your homes and forgetting my priority. Sometimes it's not even intentional. Like we've just never been taught generosity. We don't even know what to do, or we're just trapped in the systems of the world of thinking this way. But like Haggai came and spoke God's message to those people, I felt like the Lord was saying to say this to us here at Echo. Like, we got to put him first in this part of our life and take a step of faith. And the scriptures have a little word to teach us how to put God first in our money, in our area of generosity. And it's the word tithe. And now the word tithe, I know some of you are like, oh my gosh, he's going to talk about that. And you people get scared, and I get it. Like, there's scars. Some people, you've been, others have taken advantage of you, or maybe you're like authentically struggling financially. So when we talk about generosity, it's just hard. It's hard to think about how to give when you can't even pay your bills. But this command of God in the scriptures is an invitation for us. It's not supposed to be pressure or guilt. And in fact, I just want to say it up front, we are not pressuring or guilting anybody into giving here at Echo. We don't do that as a church. But we want to call you to a different perspective on this. Just like Haggai looked at the people and says, how's it working for you? I believe God looks at us and he says, you're imitating the world. How's it working for you? Because there's so much more I want to do. I want to liberate you from greed. I want to liberate you from thinking the way you're currently thinking. There is so much more. Now, the tithe literally means first 10%. So to illustrate it, let's say you make, this amount of money, and your income on an annual basis is this. What it means is this. You take the first 10% of whatever your salary is, and you give it back to God as an act of worship. And you say, God, I acknowledge you're the ultimate provider of all that I have. And the way I see you, I tell you, I acknowledge you as my provider and now my job and now my employer is by taking the first 10 of what you give me and returning it back to you. And it's back to the work of the temple is what the scripture says, which in our day, it really symbolically represents those that live on mission to take God to the people, people to God, which is the church. So we give back to God a 10. And the way I look at this is this. The 10%, we don't discern. We decide to do it. Because God made it very, very clear, the command of how to acknowledge and worship him out of gratitude for this. But then the 90% is not like he says, now take that and just do whatever you want with it. Because all of it is his. It's not just this is his, all of it is his. So this we decide, this we discern. God, I'm going to choose to give it back to you. I don't need to pray about the tithe. Like I don't wake up and say, God, should I love my wife today? Like I decide to love her. I decided 20 years ago to love her. I don't need to discern that. God already told me to. But how I love my wife, I discern. And it's the same. The tithe, we don't get to pray about. We don't get to say, maybe should I? He already told you, should you? But then this 90% we do. And we take the 90 and we're like, hey, God, what should I do with this? And I'm going to save up and I'm going to buy the car and God, do you want me to invest in college? Do you want me to give to Compassion International or to Foster the City or whatever else? So we give out of the 90, but we return the 10. The 10 is not even generosity yet. It's just stuff that is God's. And when we use it, we're literally stealing from God. And some Christians try to say, okay, but the tithe is like an Old Testament law thing and all this. And it really is not. In fact, it was before the law. It was in the law. And then Jesus himself, he said, you should tithe, yes. And to me, like if he is my Lord, and he made it that clear, it's like, he didn't say you should go ahead and pray about this. He's like, you should tithe, yes. Don't forget, though, the more important things like your posture matters. Your heart matters. This is why we don't pressure at Echo, because it would mean nothing to God. He doesn't need our resources. It's an act of worship and obedience and love and gratitude to say, God, I believe all I have is yours. Therefore, here's the symbol of that. I'm giving it back to you. And the prophet Malachi said it this way. He says, should people cheat God? And God's speaking through him. Yeah, you've cheated me. But you ask, what do you mean? And he says, when did we ever cheat you? Cheat you, the people said. And he says, you cheated me out of the tithes and offerings due to me. You're under a curse, for your whole nation has been cheating me. It's not that God curses us, but he's saying, your choices has put you under a curse. It's led you to a place that you don't have the favor of God. And he says, so bring all the tithes to the storehouse where there will be enough food in my temple. Now, let me just say this. Personally, my wife and I, we strongly believe the tithes should go to the church. And Jesus said, I'll build my church. That's what he promised to do. The storehouse symbolized God's people that are commissioned for this. So what we do is for 25 years now, We look at how much we make in a year, and we figure out that 10% of that, and we automate that generosity to our church, whatever church we belong to, for 25 years. We tell our kids this, our staff this, our leaders model this, and it's part of us saying, God, I believe in the mission of your church. And every time we do it, what happens is this. We let go of greed. It's a reminder that there's more to life than just what we get. It's a reminder that God's priorities should be my priorities. And every time we activate generosity in our lives, we see God over and over again extend his blessing over us, because his blessing is the favor and life-producing ability that he gives to those that align their lives with his will. And when we obey him, he says, that's the life I long to bless. I love it how Malachi even said, if you do this, I'm going to open the windows of heaven over you. And he says, test me in this. So I want to give you a challenge today. On your seats at every campus, you got a card that looks like this. Can you locate that? Even if you're like not sure about this, locate that card. Scan that QR code. If you need a physical card, it's in the hub later. If you're missing one of these, just raise your hand. They'll give it to you. But this little card is a challenge to our church. We call it the 90-day challenge, and we do this every single year here at Echo. And it's really obeying God when he says, test me in this. And our commitment to you is this, that if you commit to honoring God, faithfully giving 10% of your income back to your church, if this is not your church, don't do it at this church, okay? Do it to your church. But we're not going to make the promise for your church, just for our church, just to be clear. But if you do this and you don't see more of God's blessing after 90 days in your life, no questions asked, we'll return it all back to you. So you try for 90 days to honor God. We believe in it so much that we know God's going to bless you. Let me clarify, God's blessing is not necessarily financial. He's not a casino or a genie. God's blessing is so much greater. God's blessing is fruit, it's peace, it's joy, it's influence. It is us going to sleep at night and knowing, there's something energizing my soul beyond just the natural. And when we do that, God is for us. He blesses us. He gives us favor and grace. I love for you to hear a story about this. As you scan this and fill out that little form, it takes 30 seconds. Check out Carlos' story of how he took the 90-day challenge, and then I'll come right back afterwards to close our time together. Check it out.
Yeah, my name is Carlos Rivera and my wife Marisela. We've been attending Echo since 2019 when they opened the Fremont campus. And then I remember Echo come out with something that's called the Tithing Challenge. And then it was exactly in June 2019 that I remember that day that we were there. And then after the message, something was in our heart. And because looking back, we never were serious about tithing. Living here in the Bay Area, of course, it sometimes might be a little bit scary to thinking about the 10%. But anyway, after hearing that message, we felt like the Spirit, and Holy Spirit and God was putting something in our heart. It was the only thing it was missing in our journey. So then we went back home, and then we prayed about it, and then we make the decision that we're going to take the challenge. And then I believe it was 2 months after the challenge, our income actually dropped a little bit. And then I got scared. And then I talked to my wife. I said, oh my God, Marisela, I don't know if this is working. I don't know how it's going to work down the road. And then I remember she said, Carlos, no. I mean, it's basically just a test. I mean, at the end of the day, it's what our God's calling. It's about we need to return what belongs to him. And then we stick to it, to the challenge. We finished the 90-day challenge after that. But then we keep going after. And then since then, we literally have seen the blessings that God has delivered to our family, to our business, and everything around us as well. And I believe that basically was the best decision ever that we can ever make at that point. We have seen basically how God is faithful, and that he's just basically unexpectedly give you things that you don't even know that is in there. And then you can see how faithful and trustful he is when we trust on him. And I believe also that the tithing challenge, what it does is create the trust on him. Because sometimes it's not about trusting in us, it's not trusting in our job or business or how the ways that we make money, but it's because everything comes from him. And then increasing our trust through our finances in him, you can basically see what trustfulness and the faithful God he is to us.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos, for sharing your story. Would you imagine with me what would happen if God looked at even just this church, this faith community, those of us here at Echo, and he saw people that don't just say, God, I'll do this later. Don't just say, God, I'm going to give you partial obedience and delayed obedience. But God, I want you to be first in my life. I care about you. I care about your kingdom being established on the earth. And I'm going to trust you with this part of my life. Imagine what would happen. See, I think God would extend his hand of favor and grace and presence over such community. When I go to our campuses, one of my favorite things to do is hear your stories. And I love this at all, Sunnyvale, Fremont, San Jose, online even. Seeing so many lives that God has changed. Like some of you came in here and you were empty and now you're fulfilled. And you came in here with addictions, you've been set free. And God's restored some of your friendships and relationships and set you free from addictions and bondages and given you purpose to live in. And I hear these stories every single week. And I'm so grateful that God's using our community to change this region and to change so many people's lives. But at the end of the day, the thing that I think about the most is there's 95% of people in our region that still have not experienced that. And there are friends and neighbors and co-workers and sons and daughters and grandparents. And God looks at those of us that have experienced his goodness, and he's like, would you not just think of yourself? Would you leverage everything that you have to put me first with your time, with your energy, with your priorities? Waking up every morning and say, God, I want you to be first today as I go to my work, as I go to my schools, and not forget that there's a world that still needs him. And just like he called those people to take God to the people and people to their God, that is our call today. Would you close your eyes for a moment of reflection with me? And maybe just right there where you're sitting, open your hands to God. As we've talked about generosity and putting God first, I wonder if there's some things that God's stirring in you that are not first yet. It might be your time, your affection, your relationships, an area misaligned with his will. He's saying, take a minute now and just surrender it back to him. God, I want you to be first. Tell him that right now. I open my hands and my heart to you, God. I want you to be first. There's some here today that you haven't even told Jesus you want him to be first for you. The greatest display of generosity is when God sent his son into the world to carry our sins on a cross. And then he offered freely salvation, forgiveness, a life with him. And it's a free gift. And if you haven't yet made that decision, I want to encourage you right now, wherever you're sitting, to say, Jesus, I want you to be first. We call that making him your Lord. I want you to be first in my life. I surrender it all to you. And Father, I pray for our community here at Echo, that we would be the kind of community that you look at us and you are so pleased and honored because we have not delayed our obedience or given you part of our hearts, but now full sacrifice and full surrender. And I pray that we would be the kind of community that says, God, you are first. In Jesus' name I pray. God bless you, church.